I'm a bit short, so I don't like standing behind lanterns. So, good evening, everyone. We want to thank Hospice UK for doing a plenary on this topic. And unusually for a plenary session, we're going to have 3 presenters. And we're all going to do a short individual presentation, but then we wanted to give plenty of time to kind of start this conversation about how we go forward with this issue. So for me, this conference comes at a time when I'm really reflecting on the role I've played in trying to address this issue in the past and what I could and should be doing in the future. And I wanted to just share some of those more personal reflections. So I think it's important to start with understanding why we've chosen to have 3 of us here today rather than one of us. And I think a lot of that is to do with us all finding it increasingly difficult to discuss this topic, especially with predominantly white British audiences. And I think over time, I'm recognizing more that this topic for me does trigger deep-seated feelings, so feelings of being inadequate, perhaps not fitting in just as much, not really belonging. I think I feel exposed because I've spent a lot of my career trying to get people to look past my race and background, and through raising my head above the parapet with this topic, people start seeing me through that lens, and that has always only brought disadvantage for me and people that I know. And also, I think over the last year and a half, I've spent a lot of time talking to people within palliative and end-of-life care around this topic. And I guess more so now than a year and a half ago, I have an insight in the underlying subtle resistance to make the level of change that's required to actually have genuinely equitable care. I've been told, that racism isn't one of the issues that results in inequality in access to our services, that we are shoehorning racism into issues where it doesn't belong. So discussing this stuff is hard. We also wanted to kind of demonstrate that we see that there's a small but growing and hopefully a critical mass of individuals and organisations who really do want to tackle this issue, and in an uncompromising way, in a way where we really fight for equity and nothing less than that. But also that there's a diversity of opinion within this space. So even for the 3 of us, we have different thoughts on what the real priorities are, how we might focus our energies to address this issue. And we need to create space for that diversity of opinion. And we also want to recognise that all 3 of us have been privileged over the last year to be given platforms such as this to talk about this issue. But there still remains important voices that remain silenced, that haven't been amplified, that haven't been given that space. And we need to continue to listen out for those voices that we're still not hearing and provide them with that opportunity. In terms of reflecting on how my thoughts and feelings have evolved over the last year and a half, when I look back at George Floyd's death, that was a real turning point for me. And when I think about it, I remember and probably recognise more so now just how angry I was. I was so angry. I was angry at society, and I was also angry at local and national leadership in palliative and end-of-life care, in the fact that for me, there was such a big silence on how race and racism plays its part within our specialty. We thought that perhaps we were exceptional in that case. I also felt very sad for a long time for George Floyd and his family, having been someone who's experienced racism and having a family that's experienced it. I know that powerlessness, but also I felt guilty because I've never felt racism on that level. Being Pakistani rather than black makes me privileged. And also, I guess it also triggered a lot of anxiety because all of this happened within the context of COVID-19, where almost on a weekly basis around that time, I knew people who were getting COVID, people within my community who were dying in large numbers, when perhaps my colleagues and my friends who were white, British and more affluent didn't have that experience. Importantly also, though, it made me reflect on my role in perhaps enabling and perpetuating racial prejudice and discrimination. At an individual level, it made me think about how I have internal racism against people from my own community, in that I never thought that they should and could potentially have just as good an end-of-life care experience as white British middle-class patients that I was seeing. And I didn't fight for them to have that. And that manifests itself in my experiences as someone with family members dying in a hospital situation, and feeling when we were asking, can more family members visit, can important members of the community visit, because this is so important and fundamental to our culture, rather than seeing that as a strength of my culture, I was ashamed and I was embarrassed that when someone died and people from my family and my community, especially women, mourned loudly, collectively, together, rather than seeing that actually that's a strength of our culture, that we do recognise that grief and bereavement is important and we do it collectively, we publicise it, we do it together. I again felt ashamed. I've always felt ashamed in those situations. And that's because I know NHS culture. I know the culture that we work within would see that as foreign, as disruptive, and probably also undignified. And even when I've accompanied family members who can't speak English, who have poor literacy, when I've accompanied them to NHS clinic appointments, again, I've apologised and said, I'm so sorry, because I know that that is going to take extra time and resource within that limited time that that clinician has, instead of fighting for the fact that actually these people deserve to be provided with information at a level that they can understand so they autonomously can engage in shared decision making. So I really had to reflect on my individual part in enabling racial prejudice and discrimination to exist. At an interpersonal level, you know, this is the kind of racism we more commonly recognise, that between individuals and groups. So more than once I've had patients say that they didn't want me as their doctor because I wasn't white British. And again, rather than saying that that is wrong and escalating it and making sure that those who are coming up behind me didn't face the same thing, I wanted to push it under the carpet. I didn't want people to see me through that light. I didn't want to create a fuss. I just wanted to be part of the team. And that actually wasn't the best response. And also, you know, when a palliative care nurse said that she didn't think it was her role as a nurse, but also the role of the hospice to support a Muslim patient to pray in their last days of life, that even though I escalated that to their line manager, I didn't see it through to see what was actually done to ensure that any patients that were supported by that patient weren't discriminated. Again, I didn't follow that through. And that, again, was my failing. And probably one of the most enlightening things as I've thought about this issue about racism is my understanding that racism is a structural, it's a system level issue. We all as individuals, even those of us from minority groups, have the capacity to have racial prejudice, i.e. think that we're better than someone else based on race and ethnicity. We can discriminate against them on that basis. But for racism, that's about individuals and groups who have power over other individuals or groups and use that power systematically to disadvantage those groups. So if we are going to tackle racism, we need to focus on where the power lies to enable that to happen and to redistribute that. And to me, we can accept nothing less than equal representation at the decision-making table, at the most senior level. But again, when I reflect on my experiences over the last year and a half, I've been invited to lots of committees, think tanks, presentations such as this. And I've always seen that as a positive thing, that people really want to diversify the voices that they're hearing. But if in those situations you do not create an environment that is inclusive, and what I mean by inclusive is that I can bring my whole self, that I do not need to assimilate to the dominant culture within those groups or the power structure, then actually you're not doing me any favours, you're not listening. Furthermore, if in those spaces there is not equity, and what I mean by that is constant and consistent assessment of where the power lies and redistributing that, again, you are inviting me to share something that is really important to me. It's an issue of life or death for those of us from minority groups, but we're not given any power to enact any of that change, and that is actually more damaging. The final thing I wanted to kind of share was the thing that I've been reflecting most on recently, which is, what does anti-racism actually look like? So I think there is a need for that individual self-reflection on the role we as individuals may play. It's that recognition of when interpersonal racism occurs and making sure that we are allies and identify that and do not allow it to occur. And it's ensuring that those power differentials are redistributed. But the thing I keep coming back to is the need for kindness and compassion in this space. That we need to be kind and compassionate to people who want to be allies in this space, who really want to make a difference but don't know how to. And they're so afraid of saying or doing the wrong thing, they feel paralyzed. We need to create spaces where people can make mistakes and still be seen as doing the right thing and at least trying. I think we also need to be kind and compassionate for people who perceive or potentially will be disadvantaged by any affirmative actions we take to try and create more equitable services, especially because we know resources will always be limited. And we need to be kind and listen to those voices too. And probably the thing that I've come to very late is the need for kindness and compassion and acceptance for those of us from minority groups that actually we have a limited role we can play in this space. We don't have the power. And that makes me think of this quote by Toni Morrison, which states, I can't read that because my glasses aren't very good. So it states, the function, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, so you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact it is. Somebody says you have no art, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. And that makes me reflect that maybe all this anti-racism work that we're spending so much time and energy away from our family and loved ones trying to enact change, maybe it's just a distraction, maybe it's a function of racism. That perhaps this is our Sisyphean task, that we just have to roll this boulder up the hill only for it to roll down again, and then we're compelled to roll it up again, and somehow we've got to find some meaning within that. That maybe in 10, 20, 30 years we'll be presenting the same stories and the same data and nothing will have changed. And if we look at history, that's probably more likely than not. But in my heart, and it is my heart that I'm having to rely on now, I genuinely believe, through discussions I've had with people who are here today in this audience, that in the majority, in palliative and end-of-life care services in the UK, people do want to tackle this injustice. That we recognise that the roots of palliative care in the UK come from wanting to tackle injustice. So I think there is buy-in into the why, and now we need to focus on the how. And I think the basis of that has to be having open, inclusive, safe spaces for everyone to be heard, including those who most disagree with us. Thank you. I'll let Jonathan go.